Since starting this YouTube channel and discussing my journey of being a late diagnosed autistic person, I've received comments now and again from people asking, I think I'm autistic, what do I do? So I thought I'd give you some thoughts and some of my experiences in this video. If we're being really honest with ourselves, I think we have to realise that being able to access an autism assessment is a real privilege in itself when you factor in the costs involved for many people, as well as the enormous waiting lists and waiting times. And for many people, they have to go out of their way to research finding a psychiatrist or psychologist with a special interest in ASD. And all of these things are just not accessible to a whole lot of people. I know how extremely fortunate I am because here in England you can access assessments for autism free of charge, although there are enormous waiting lists. And I went via the Right to Choose pathway, which is a common pathway for those that are accessing assessments as adults via the NHS. And I know there is absolutely no way I'd be able to afford an assessment if I were to go privately. I have a chronic illness, so I'm really limited in the amount of kind of free cash that I have available. So if it wasn't for the Right to Choose pathway, I would be a self-diagnosed autistic person. And self-diagnosis is really valid because ultimately, when we're finding out about autism and how much it relates to ourselves, it's really all about trying to understand ourselves better. So I think in order to feel comfortable in describing yourself as a self-diagnosed autistic person, I think it takes a whole lot of research, doesn't it? And I don't doubt you've already done loads of research in order for you to have ended up watching this video, but I'm just going to go through a few things that I found helpful to research really. Online tests are of course really helpful, and I'd encourage you to take as many as you can really. In fact, the AQ50 was the first test that I took years ago now, and it started me thinking that I could be autistic. There's also the CAPT-Q test, along with the ASPE quiz, and Asperger's is of course no longer given as a diagnosis these days. It's instead included in the autism spectrum. And there's also the Monotropism test if you fancy giving that one a go. And Monotropism is a unique cognitive style characterised by an intense focus on specific interests or activities. And I'll leave links to these down below for you. If you haven't done so already, I'd advise you to have a look at the DSM-5, and it stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for the 5th edition. And here you'll see essentially a checklist of what's required in order to meet a formal diagnosis for autism spectrum disorder. And I appreciate that some of this information can feel really overwhelming. So there are lots of YouTube creators out there in the autism community that have thankfully done some videos on these, so it might be helpful to go and have a look at those. There are a whole load of books out there, and although it's not a book about autism, Fern Brady's autobiography, Strong Female Character, about her life as a late diagnosed autistic person was such a good read for me, as I really related to her sometimes chaotic lifestyle in her teens and early adult years, and also the lack of support from her family. I'm dyslexic, so it takes me ages to get through non-textbooks, but I've just ordered in these two books here. The first is Unmasking Autism by Dr. Devon Price, and also Asperger's by Rudy Simone, although there are loads of other books out there, and I'd love to hear your recommendations for books on autism down below as well. On the iPlayer here in the UK, there's a 2-part documentary called Inside Our Autistic Minds. created by Chris Packham, an autistic person, and it's just so interesting. I loved the whole documentary, to be honest, but I really resonated with a young woman called Flo, who was super honest about her struggles with masking and unmasking. It's just so interesting to watch. And this, of course, is just one documentary. I'm sure there's loads of them out there, and by all means, leave your recommendations below as well. I'm a really visual person, so I really gravitate towards YouTube whenever I want to find out about something, really. And there are loads of autistic YouTubers out there. I found it really hard initially to try and find YouTubers that I could connect with, but I found as time's gone on, what I've done is to develop more of a kind of pick and mix approach, in that I really try and zone in on similarities that I share with some YouTubers and almost not expect as much from them, but really trying to relate on the kind of common language that we might have. Also, what I found is that there are fewer middle-aged autistic YouTubers, or certainly through my searches anyway, and it was one of the reasons why I wanted to set up this channel, really to be able to connect with other people, because I think at each age group we have our own kind of challenges, don't we? So I just wanted to give the middle-aged experience a bit of representation, really. And also the YouTube community has been so helpful, and I found it in the main to be really inclusive. What I would say, however, is that whenever I've done kind of cursory searches on other social media platforms, I can't help but notice pockets of infighting going on between autistic people, and it really saddens me, really, because I think that in itself really discourages other autistic people from joining in conversations, really. And that we know that's really beneficial in terms of helping improve our own mental health, really. So because of this, unfortunately, I'd advise you to really try and choose your social platforms wisely, really, because it's somewhere that you should feel safe, really. So I think once you're at a stage where you feel kind of comfortable in being a self-described or self-diagnosed autistic person, it's really important to ask yourself why you would want to seek a formal diagnosis. Really because of potential cost implications, and it can be a really lengthy process, which can be quite anxiety inducing at times. It could be, and probably would be, for your own sense of self-validation. It might be because you want other people to understand you better with an autism diagnosis, although in many cases some people might be more understanding of you and your journey and your story. There's no guarantee of that, and many people are so dismissive of autism or ASD that a formal diagnosis might not matter to them. They may well think that because you don't act autistic enough, or because you don't look autistic enough, that the diagnosis doesn't make very much sense. Perhaps their reliance on old stereotypes and ideas of what an autistic person is. They've probably watched Rain Man at some point and just can't get that whole descriptor of what an autistic person is outside of their heads, really. They may well rebuff your diagnosis with the trope that everybody's a little bit autistic. And when we think about family members, there's no guarantee that they'll take your diagnosis on board, because it might well be triggering for them. It's very well known that autism runs in families, and it may well be too challenging for some people to have to face their own reality. Also, if you were to receive a formal autism diagnosis, there are no medications that you can access because it's a neurodevelopmental condition. Sorry, I always struggle with that word. In the same way that somebody perhaps with ADHD can access medicines, there's no real government-funded supports available for late diagnosed autistic people with low support needs in terms of emotional supports or practical supports or financial supports, although it is actually a bit of a grey area. In the UK, we had a benefit system called Disability Living Allowance up until a few years ago, which has now been replaced by PIP, which I believe is Personal Independence Payments, and it's designed to financially support people with a long-term mental health condition or those with a disability. However, whenever I've looked at PIP from my MCAS separately, it's a really confusing system, it's really hard to navigate, and in my opinion it's a completely ableist system because it's designed for disabled people to fail. Now, if you're an autistic person with higher support needs, or you feel that your disability is impacting your day-to-day life in a way that you need additional financial support, you should absolutely be looking at PIP. But I'd probably advise you to speak with your local Citizens Advice Bureau just for guidance on how to navigate the process, really. I don't know if they do help you complete the forms anymore. I think they used to, but that's something that you'll need to research on a local level. A formal diagnosis of autism might help healthcare workers better understand your needs in terms of sensory issues. For instance, I went to a dental hygienist a few months ago, not long after my diagnosis, and every time you go, they ask you if you've any updates to your health status, really. So I told them I was autistic, and it was really interesting because during the process, the hygienist kept kind of stopping quite regularly just to check in with me to see if I was okay, which is a really nice gesture actually. But I think because I'm so used to powering through any dental work, because I really don't like it, I'd just rather crack on with it. But it's really nice to know that some healthcare practitioners will just check in with you to see if you're okay. There might also be considerations around insurance that you might want to think about before you go for a diagnosis, in the form of travel insurance, health insurance, and life insurance. And some countries it might be a little bit more difficult to apply for residency as well, so it's just something to be aware of. A formal diagnosis will be helpful, however, in the workplace, because in law, being autistic is a protected characteristic, so you can liaise with your workplace if you need any accommodations put in place. For me, one of the main motivators for seeking an autism diagnosis was the fact that I've got a chronic health condition called MCAS, and it's often comorbid with ASD, so I felt that it would be really helpful in terms of getting my MCAS diagnosis, because it's quite a difficult illness to pin down. And also I found that when I was entering my perimenopausal years, a lot of my autistic traits were becoming really quite pronounced, and yeah, it just made me really want to get that diagnosis, really. And I do have a video actually on autism and perimenopause as well, if you want to go and check that one out afterwards. But of course, in addition to those, it was just really validating for me to be able to get a formal ASD diagnosis, really. Seeing your GP about an autism assessment can be really nerve-wracking, and I know in my situation it took me a few attempts to build up the confidence to be able to talk about it. I was very matter-of-fact with my GP in the end, and I in fact mentioned it at the end of a consultation about something else because I just felt brave in the moment, and he was actually really brilliant about it. And he just told me, he asked me if I had the right paperwork with me, and I did, and he said just to hand it in at reception before I left so they could just administer that, basically. So because I went with the right to choose pathway via the NHS, The doctor will then just take your paperwork, which in my case was the AQ10, and I basically just had to personalise a letter that you'll see here. And they take those two documents and they add on, I think, a brief medical summary of you as their patients, and then they'll send that on to the assessment provider, and that in my case was Psychiatry UK. They are a private organisation, but they have a contract basically via the NHS to provide ASD assessments and ADHD assessments. Just a point to mention actually that if you have any difficulties with your GP and you're based in England, in terms of them taking you seriously, you can refer to their NICE guidelines, and in this case it's Clinical Guideline 142, and NICE guidelines are essentially guidelines that NHS workers have to follow. It's like an instruction manual basically for care practitioners. Now, I have MCAS, which is a condition that isn't recognised by the NHS, and there are no guidelines or NICE guidelines for it, so I'm basically lost in the wilderness with this illness. So having this clinical guideline is actually really powerful for you, but if your doctor is still reluctant to take you seriously, at this point I would ask for a second opinion. Now, I am aware that many people watching this video aren't from the UK, and in fact, YouTube Studio tells me that a whole lot of you are from America. Now, I'm no expert, unfortunately, on American healthcare, but I would imagine it's kind of a similar process where if you speak to your doctor or your primary care physician and ask for guidance basically, or you could maybe research appropriate psychiatrists or psychologists and just make sure that they have a specialist interest in ASD. And again, I've no idea about health insurance, so perhaps that's something our American friends can help out with down below in comments, because again, I don't live in America, so I don't know what the system is, unfortunately. So once my paperwork was received by Psychiatry UK, I think it took only a matter of weeks actually for them to send me notice of basically they'd received my application, and they also asked me to complete the AQ50 test. And they also sent me a form that was really lengthy, so it took me a really long time to complete it. I was really worried that they wouldn't be able to fully assess me because firstly, I've got a really, really dreadful long-term memory. So I remember only a few things really from childhoods. And also my parents died years ago now, so I wasn't able to have their inputs, and I've got no video footage or anything like that from years ago. I also have no friends from childhood, so I thought that might be difficult. But what was really helpful is that they asked for my partner to complete a form, and Ian and I have been together for 17 years, so he obviously understands me really well. So I just felt, relieved that they were happy to take on his experience of me as an autistic person. Now, because I've got a dreadful memory, what I found that I had to do, and the reason why it took me so long to fill out the form, was basically I was really trying to encourage memories to come back, and that can be quite a time-consuming process really, and I have to say it's a really traumatic process as well. So I would just give you a little alert here to really try and look after your own mental health at this stage during the process. It can be quite overwhelming, or certainly I found the process to be anyway. So my actual physical assessments with the psychiatrist was probably around a year after I first submitted my form, so it's quite a lengthy process. And what I found really helpful was it's an online appointment, so can't remember if it's Zoom or Google Hangouts or something like that they use, but for me, because I have MCAS, it's really difficult for me to leave my home, so that just took a whole weight off my mind, really, that I was able to conduct that from, you know, the comfort of my own home, really. And again, it was a really emotional experience. I was really nervous for a good 2 weeks up until the assessment dates. It was all I could think about. I couldn't concentrate on anything at all because it's just such a massive thing, isn't it? But my psychiatrist was just so brilliant, really. She was super understanding, really empathetic, and obviously had a huge amount of experience in talking with autistic people. So I just felt really heard. I'd say the actual assessment itself took around maybe an hour and a half, and she did explain at the start of the session that it might be a few weeks before I hear the results of the assessments. So I was prepared for that at the beginning of the assessment, but I was really shocked that she was able to offer a diagnosis on the day because I just met so much of the criteria, really. So it was about a month later that I received a full comprehensive reports of my diagnosis and my psychiatrist's findings, and that confirmed ASD level 1. And it's really quite overwhelming and quite emotional to see your whole life written down in pages and pages of kind of information like that. And also, it's quite validating to have a professional psychiatrist to go through all of this information and to say at the end of it, you know, this is autism. This time can be really overwhelming, and I'm still going through all of the process in trying to kind of take on board fully this diagnosis, really. And it can feel like you've been left alone with all of this massive amount of information. And I think one of the issues around that is that because Right to Choose and Going Through Psychiatry UK is a private organisation, for whatever reason, that you can't then go back to the NHS and ask for any kind of emotional support or therapy. It's just the way the system is, unfortunately. But for me, I didn't mind too much because whenever I've tried therapy in the past, it's really not been very good for me. And I'll probably do a video on this at some point, but I realise now it's because I'm autistic, and that's the reason why therapy has been really quite difficult for me. So if you're in a similar predicament at this point of getting a diagnosis, it might be worth looking at private therapy if that's something that you felt would help you kind of absorb all of this information. And at this point, I think a lot of people start talking about unmasking, don't they, after a formal diagnosis. And I guess I'm at a stage where I don't know what to think about unmasking. I think it's really difficult for any autistic person, but in middle age, because everything feels so entrenched in you as a person. I don't know how something that feels so ingrained can be, I don't know, dismantled. I don't know if that's the right word, really, but I think above all, I'm just trying to be kind to myself and to just take time in trying to absorb this information. And I have to say, my partner's been absolutely brilliant throughout all of this process, and he's been such a rock. And I know I'm really fortunate to have a person who really understands around me, because not everybody does. I think the whole concept of finding your tribe is really important for all autistic people, and whether you're self-diagnosed or clinically diagnosed, it's just really nice to be able to see other people or hear from other people that you have kind of connections with, really. It's really lovely for those that have really good relationships with their family and friends, and they've been comfortable in sharing the fact that they're autistic with them, and they feel like they've been supported through that process. But we know that that's not the case for many autistic people, I've still to tell anybody in real life that I'm autistic, and I don't know that I will. I'll have to wait and see as to how I feel, you know, whenever the opportunity arises. So I know how important it is for me to be able to connect and hear from other autistic people, and certainly YouTube's been brilliant for that. I only set up my channel a few months ago now, but already I feel like I'm kind of connecting with other autistic people, and to share stories and experiences is really validating, and it can only be a great thing for your mental health to feel part of a community and to finally be able to share things in common with other people. So I think that's where I'm going to end this video, because I already feel like it's gone on way too long, but we'll see in editing. So thank you for watching. I hope you found this kind of useful in some way, maybe. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic, because it's, you know, just such a big thing, isn't it? What do I do with this information now that I think I'm autistic? So thank you for watching. I'll be back soon with another video. Give it a like if you got this far, and I'll see you again soon.